Step up to the plate and get your QPL Special Edition Mets Library card. Current QPL cardholders and new card applicants can get this free card at any QPL location. Learn more at queenslibrary.org/Mets and check out our amazing array of free books and services at Queens Public Library. Libraries are full of stories in a variety of formats, from picture books to large print, audiobooks to ebooks, and more. But there's so much more to the story. This National Library Week, from April 23rd through April 29th, discover everything that Queens Public Library has to offer beyond books. Visit queenslib.org/libraryweek23 for more information. Hip hop's 50th anniversary represents a milestone for a global genre of music and culture that started right here in NYC. Queens Public Library, with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, is embarking on an epic year-long celebration. The programs that are part of this national initiative will be in person, live-streamed, and archived for future generations. Register today to stay up to date on scheduled events at hiphop50.queenslibrary.org.
Welcome to the Queens Public Library's talk with Brian Alessandro, author of Performer Non Grata. Junot Díaz, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, wrote about this book that it's a madhouse novel, both scathing and unforgettably tender, in which the real and the absurd are one. Alessandro is a virtuoso. Edmund White wrote, Brian Alessandro's satire is warm but stinging. His view of toxic masculinity is accurate and compassionate. He's inventive, funny, odd. He's speaking to our crazy times. Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Diane Seuss stated, Brian Alessandro's Performer Non Grata is a face-meltingly perverse satire come farce, a sort of contemporary love child of Wilde and Burroughs, streaming with blood, splooge, booze, snot, Bitcoin, Litcoin. This is all true. Dancing with turgidity. Jared Conley, author of Boy Erased, said Alessandro has written a psychoanalytic farce on our strange political moment using the Bonaventura family as a decoder. I laughed and groaned my way through this family's mishaps. Alessandro is working on in an endangered queer genre. It's rare to find such Sadian wickedness and wit in a contemporary novel. And here is that novel. Hi, I'm Gol Beckerman, the books editor for The Atlantic and the author most recently of The Quiet Before on the unexpected origins of radical ideas. And earlier before that, a few years before, When They Come For Us Will Be Gone, the epic struggle to save Soviet Jewry. Before The Atlantic, I was a writer and an editor for the New York Times Book Review. Culture Connection, which is what we are doing today, is curated by Daniel Zaletsky and is now in its 10th year at the Queens Public Library. It's proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. And now expanding into a virtual format, Cultural Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Our author today, Brian Alessandro, who many will be familiar with from Culture Connection, has written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Pank, Huffington Post, Lambda Literary, and recently co-adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel. He also co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs, an anthology of essays and interviews about Burroughs. Performer Non Grata, his second novel, was released this past Tuesday. Yay, by Rebel Satori Press. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Gol.
I feel like
Great job. I feel like I'm out of a job.
I feel intimidated because I'm doing your job here.
That's a fantastic intro. You did a very natural, smooth, organic delivery.
Okay, I'm trying my best. It's hard, big shoes to fill. Well, as I told you before we went on, I was sort of, I too had my face blown off by your novel. I'm glad that it's still all intact. It's really, kind of touches on every hot button issue in our culture right now. It's about sex and gender, about the internet and what it does to us, about identity, about cancel culture. And also, it seemed to me it's fundamentally about what insecurity can do to people.
Yes.
But we'll sort of get into all that. But I think for the viewers, the best first thing that we can do, it seems to me, is to just give them a taste of the novel itself, of the style of it, of the way you're going about telling this satirical story. So why don't you take it away and give us a few minutes from a few pages from the book?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Thank you. Theodore Bonaventura's parents weren't bad people. Misunderstood? Maybe. Self-involved? Possibly. Vain? At the very least. Morally complex? Only when he was feeling charitable. When dealt with on an individual basis, they could be downright pleasant, even enjoyable. It was when they were together that they formed a chimeric beast, an unstoppable monster on parity with creatures of Greek myth. The 16-year-old had hoped that the unauthorized documentary he'd been shooting about them, intending to capture their marriage in all its heightened melodrama, would go some way in mitigating his contempt. He was wrong. The behavior of Risk Bonaventura and Lorna Hall Bonaventura was anything but predictable. Early on, Theo learned that diversion was an effective self-preserving exercise. In addition to the movie about his parents, he also designed and constructed costumes for his drag queen friend, his straight drag queen friend, Charlie. Intermittently, he edited a video series of clumsy strangers taking public spills down flights of stairs or into park ponds or off benches and uploaded them onto his YouTube channel, which had become increasingly popular. Less often, he drew perverted cartoons. Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck did the most heinous things to each other in his warped universe to work through rare creative blocks. And when he wasn't engaged in any of those activities, Theo fussed with his fabricated online persona. That evening, Theo had been on project number 5, editing the profile of Tristan Goodman on Instagram. At first blush, the photo of the man looked enough like Theo, though with more enviable testosterone-laden features. A strong jawline, a cleft chin, a prominent brow, a Romanesque nose, thicker hair, and a more developed body. Tristan's skin tone was tawny, whereas Theo's was ashen. Tristan looked to be in his late 30s with a thick hormonal 5 o'clock shadow. Theo was still only 16 with a porcelain complexion. The silhouette Tristan cut was brawny with long, fibrous sinew, showy vascularity worthy of a GQ or Men's Health cover. Because Theo was a wonder with retouching, augmenting, and reshaping images in Photoshop, and possessed the impetus to envision himself as something greater, he executed startling transformations, at least in cyberspace. The pseudo-profile had been created 2 years ago, and its inventor was currently adding biographical detail in the form of current events. Theo posted on the social media app a photo of his latest drawing, a gangbang with the supple who's, in the Seussical sense, quartering a naked Grinch with disarming sex appeal as they took turns burrowing into his Whoville. Theo conceptualized the piece as a Gulliver's Travel type scenario in which the Lilliputians bound and tormented, and in this case, penetrated their invasive giant. In the text section, Theo wrote, "Just won first prize in a Northeastern erotic satire contest. Of course, this was a made-up award and a phony competition, but whoever bothered to fact-check anymore anyway?" In addition to Instagram, Theo also posted the drawing and text on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, TikTok, and Vine. Though he anticipated that he'd be flagged and taken down at some point, once one narc or another reported the lewd art. It was a routine to which he'd become accustomed. Being a member of Generation Z, even less impressed with everything than their forebears, Millennials and Generation X, and in search of perpetual entertainment, or at least distraction, Theo switched gears once again and returned to the documentary about his parents. He had been covertly recording them on his iPhone for several weeks and had dumped over 10 hours of uncut footage onto an external terabyte drive. Theo reviewed the last scene as he shot, replaying the shorter clip 3 times. The magnum opus would be presented as a film by Theo Bonaventura. the Tristan Goodman alter ego could be compartmentalized after all. That's mother, Dr. Lorna Hall Bonaventura, editing her book about rape and how important tough guys are in modern society and crap, Theo had whispered into the camera as he framed his parents at the dinner table, lazily reviewing work documents and drinking wine. Everybody's been giving her shit about it, but I think she gets off on the attention honestly. And then dear old dad, Risk Bonaventura. My grandparents actually really named him Risk because supposedly his father, my granddad, always saw risk-taking as the greatest, noblest virtue of a man, a quintessentially American character trait to an Italian immigrant who must always wear the pants, though mother wears them a lot better. He's the rich one, an investment banker who just had to open a network of charter schools and even, get this, hire himself as a history teacher, trying to live out some white savior fantasy or something lame, like teaching poor kids in the ghetto is going to make him like himself or impress anyone. He doesn't even like poor people. I guess it looks like he's grading papers now or whatever. Risk was speaking to Lorna about Spain. Though they were down the hall in Risk's den, Theo could hear them. His father's conversations over the phone with business associates or in person with mother were audible when Theo wasn't listening to music or watching TV, and they always sounded like a put-on. The acoustics in the old apartment were sharp and voices carried. Theo paused his movie and moved to the door, opened it, and crept down the hall with his camera-ready phone. He was an expert eavesdropper. Madrid, really? Said Lorna, loitering in the threshold of her husband's home office. And I'm just supposed to do what? Drop my career? I'm not saying I want to go anytime soon, dear, but eventually. I thought it might be a nice place to spend some time. You know, once Theo was out of high school and in college. Yeah, and that's no fewer than 2 years away, Risk. Well, maybe not right after, maybe not at all. Even with her back turned toward him, Theo could tell that his mother was making that face, a cross between a smirk and a scowl, an expression that she reserved for moments where she hoped to both humiliate and intimidate. It was a face she reserved mainly for Risk, and on occasion, a student or colleague. Okay, thanks.
Fantastic. So
Thank you.
I mean, the benefit of that also is now, you know, we've sort of been introduced to three of our main characters, right?
Right.
So let's start off with the thing that sort of strikes me the most about this book is the way you're sort of using it to explore masculinity and the sort of social pressures around masculinity. Because, you know, from the very first pages, we have, you know, Theo watching wrestling videos and sort of trying to, you know, seeing this sort of exaggerated vision of what it means to be a man. And then his father is sort of dreaming about being a matador. So, and this is a theme that sort of courses its way throughout the entire book. So I'm curious first, just to start off, like, what about this topic felt so rich to you?
You know, there's so many different ways to answer that question. Coming at it from a personal point of view, I think it's something that I've always wrestled with or questioned because as a gay man, it is definitely a very sensitive bone of contention within the community, this idea of masculinity and versus femininity, and how there is sometimes a preference or a fetish for the masculine over the feminine with terms of, you know, in terms of behavior. And I've always found that to be both troubling and also fascinating. I'm also struck by, on a more kind of geopolitical level, that whenever, like, Hillary Clinton is a pretty good case study, I think, because I conceived this book in 2017. It was right after Donald Trump became president and obviously Hillary's loss. I was, again, fascinated by and also disturbed by this idea that there is always not only a preference for a man to serve as leader, which is, I think, a cultural problem. And the fact that we haven't had a female president yet is sort of disgraceful. But when we do also have a female candidate, she has to kind of, and I might get some heat for this, but don a kind of masculine cloak. And I'm not saying that that's right. It's not a judgment. It's an observation. You know, become an even bigger proponent of the industrial prison complex, or an even bigger proponent of wars. That if you have like a Jill Stein, for example, who's peace, she's quickly marginalized. But if you have someone who wants to be a true serious candidate, like Hillary Clinton, she has to be able to hang with the big boys. And I feel like that kind of aggression and brutality and chest beating is a problem with not masculinity itself. I'm not sure that's what I'm attacking. I think it's our perception of what masculinity is supposed to be.
Right.
And how we extol the worst parts of it.
Well, I mean, with these characters, they're confused about what it means, what masculinity means. They're both, and it is interesting that it's kind of, it's not just the younger generation; it's also the father Risk. And Lorna to some extent is like also confused, very confused. It's not. It seems it's not so much that there is this sort of vision of masculinity that they're all trying to aspire to. It's that they're confused about the degree to which they should want that.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that the reason why so much of this story is also about cancel culture and also about social media, and also about history on some level, because Lorna is a professor of classics, and she's constantly legitimizing her perspective, her positions by referencing ancient art or ancient behavior or classic works of high art. I think it's because they are all kind of confused, and I think that in their minds they are pursuing power and status, and to them those are predominantly masculine possessions. And for Lorna, I think it's not a secret that she's based on, in part, Camille Paglia. And I don't know if it's certainly not a flattering portrait, but I'm not sure it's entirely damning either. I try to be, as Junot Díaz said, as sort of harsh as I am compassionate about them. But yeah, I would say you're absolutely right in that perspective, that they are completely confused about not just who they are, but how they're supposed to be and how they want to be perceived.
Right. I mean, that part felt very, actually, there was a kind of complexity that felt very true to our world today, which is, men both have this idea that, as you said, like that it is a man who's the one who's in power, that there is sort of, in spite of all the changes that happen sort of at the cultural ground level, there are certain political realities that still give a man power. But there are sort of like competing signals, I feel that men get. There's like a desire, to be, I mean, I guess also it depends sort of where you are in the world, but in the world, at least that I know, it's like nobody, women, men, nobody responds to a Donald Trump type, individual. So you sort of still have that input that there is something sort of positive and powerful associated with being a man of that type, that kind of that sort of the alpha male, but at the same time, you are, that you can't really give in to that impulse. In the same way, we'll talk about the sort of the matador and what the bullfighting represents, but it's sort of the what I mean to say is that there's like an attraction, but then also like a repulsion at the same time.
Yeah, you hit it on the head, and that's one of my favorite topics, is this sort of interplay between repulsion and attraction. It's one of the things that I most like to write about, and I think that all of my characters are wrestling with this idea, and not just. But the problem is that it doesn't necessarily come from an organic place for them. Again, there's such constructions, there's such self-conscious constructions, and they are put together by what they think the culture wants.
Right.
Even young Theo, who's only 16, who on some level is the most genuine, but on another level is the most constructed.
Right. And I mean, one of the sort of wonderful metaphors for that is that he's taking these innocent cartoon characters, and
perverting them,
and sort of, but not, and perverting them in specific ways, making them sort of hypersexual, hyper masculine in some ways, sort of outsized genitals. It's just it's
cartoonish.
Yes, it's cartoonish. Well, to continue with the sort of cartoonish idea, I am kind of curious. So Theo creates these kind of outsized personas for himself
Mhm.
online, right? And it gives him some freedom to explore his identity to some extent. But it also seems that satire works in a similar way. It's that you're at some level, though these characters definitely, have humanity to them, they're also caricatures, and
Yes.
they give you sort of an opportunity to play with ideas.
Yes. And that was the challenge for me, is I wanted to create a kind of you know, a projection or a representation of a person, a caricature of a person, so that I can use them as vessels to explore these ideas and to poke fun at some of these ideas and to poke fun at some of these types of people. And sometimes you do meet people who really do feel like caricatures,
Right.
but they're real people. But I also wanted to imbue them with as much humanity and compassion as I could. And that's a very difficult balance. And I think if I had to grade myself, it was probably 60% satire, 40%
Mhm.
humanity. I don't know. You read it, if that's a fair
Yeah.
assessment.
No, it is. I mean, there's moments where you feel that it's over the top, but it
Mhm.
seems that it's what I mean to say is it feels like it's over the top for a reason, that you're sort of
Yes.
throwing these characters into these extreme situations, having them do extreme things, so that you can explore an idea.
Yes. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, and it's I'm always sort of very fascinated by these novelists who can sort of present their characters and their stories as almost like a living, breathing essay, like an essay in disguise, because they have all these concerns and these anxieties and these curiosities, and they could just write a collection of essays, but they instead write a novel and they explore these themes and ideas through fiction. People like Don DeLillo or David Foster Wallace,
Mhm.
they were able to do this very well. They are able. Mary Gateskill is able to do this very
Mm.
well too. I think she doesn't get enough credit for that.
Right. And there is a level of sort of what one could call satire in those books, that with
Sure.
certain characters. Um, Tell me what, just because for people watching this, they don't know like the trajectory of the novel, but Madrid and bullfighting play a big
Mhm.
role
Yeah.
at some point, or throughout. I mean, is part of that kind of hybrid repulsion attraction. So talk to me about sort of
I,
the role of Madrid, and maybe set up a little bit, sort of how that works into the story.
Sure. So I've been to Spain twice. The first time was when I was 16 years old, and then I went again when I was 18. And I didn't see a bullfight because I was too revolted by the idea. But we were in Pamplona right after the running of the bulls, and I remember the shopkeepers hosing off their cobblestone walkways because there was so much blood that had spilled, both humans and the bulls. And without criticizing a culture, I find it objectively inhumane to treat animals that way, and uh, I think that it left a real deep impression. And I
Mm.
think I was 16 years old, so I was still pretty impressionable, and it stayed with me for a really long time. I also became fascinated by sort of matador culture and the perception of the matador as this sort of incredibly heroic and brave and sort of sexy figure. And I know Pedro Almodovar made his incredible movie Matador in the late 80s, early 90s, and he looks at the sort of complex portrayal or existence of a matador in terms of how they can be kind of eroticized and fetishized, but also as these sort of instruments of great brutality and cruelty and apathy.
Mhm.
So I started wanting to explore that role in that culture for those reasons. But so just to back up, my character Risk Bonaventura, he's in finance. He does very well for himself. He makes a lot of money, but he feels as though he is um, too sort of removed from any kind of true masculine pursuit or any kind of true blue collar authenticity. So he creates a series of charter schools and he hires himself as a history teacher so that he could feel like an everyman. That doesn't work out. It turns out to be a complete disaster. So then he moves on to sort of his other boyhood dream, which is to become an athlete. And so he chooses Spain and Madrid to move his family, Lorna and his son Theo, to, and buy his way, because he's very wealthy, buy his way into the bull ring. Of course, I did a fair amount of research into matador culture, and these men start off as very young boys, 13, 14 years old. They are kind of reared into this profession. And at a certain point, it becomes sort of like a suit that they put on that feels very comfortable, familiar. So for a middle-aged man to start, no matter how athletic or fit you think you are, to start doing this without having had a background, of course, it's going to spell disaster. And he is naturally gored by the bull and left partially disabled. And things get worse from there for him and his family.
It struck me that it was almost like an analog version of what Theo is doing online.
Yes.
He's trying to sort of project himself into a kind of, idealized masculine image that he has of himself.
Precisely. Yeah. He's doing in cyberspace what his father is doing with corporality.
But then also the Matador, as you said, and it's so interesting to think of the Matador as kind of a queer persona in some ways. That there is something almost like a little and I don't know if androgynous is the word, but they are kind of both, right? I mean, there is almost like a femininity to their movements, to the way they dress, to even like so many of these men are just sort of like beautiful, groomed people, and yet they're doing something that we associate with this incredibly violent act of killing.
They're incredibly glamorous. There is a quality of sort of femininity in the garb and the regalia, and they can't even get into it themselves. They need a squire to help them get into it because it's so difficult and so tight. It's so tight that the genitals are sort of accented to a sort of pornographic degree. So it's sexualized and it's eroticized and it's almost like a kind of drag on a certain level.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
But yeah, they're murderers, right? They're murdering a bull for entertainment, for the sake of spectacle. And that's another thing that really strikes me is not just Spain's fixation on spectacle, but the world's fixation on spectacle, even when it results in literal blood spill, when it's, be it boxing or mixed martial arts or bullfighting.
Yeah. I wonder if I had moments where I felt like this was, maybe this is not true for how you thought about it, but it seemed like a response to Hemingway and the way that Hemingway, like where bullfighting fit into Hemingway's sort of, worldview. And it was, I think for him, the ultimate sort of condensed, life and death, like the essence of everything, and also this incredibly masculine sort of act that he imbued it with.
I just grabbed my book because there's a blurb by David Santos Donaldson, the very great writer. He wrote Greenland, which came out last year. He has this great quote. As the novel centers on the world of Spanish bullfighting with taut, muscular prose, one cannot help but recall Hemingway. Only Alessandro turns Hemingway's antiquated machismo on its head and kicks it directly in its manhood. Yeah. that was like, wow, he got it. I was trying to subvert not just Hemingway, but also the legacy and the allure of that kind of writing and that kind of romanticism. Hemingway was a great craftsman and he was an excellent writer. I'm taking nothing away from him, but yeah, I mean, I was teaching in the summer of 2017. I was teaching The Short Happy Life of Francis Macumber, and that's when the enzyme of this story came to me. It was while I was teaching that short during summer school. Yeah.
How did you? I mean, are you? When you would read Hemingway's depictions of bullfighting, did you have in your mind, like, how do I want to do this differently? Because it's this incredibly glorified thing, as he describes it, but also extremely bloody, and he doesn't hide the brutality of it. It's just the brutality of it sort of is like vaunted in the way that he depicts it.
Well, I was happy that Diane Seuss and Garrett Conley both referenced Wilde, Oscar Wilde, in their blurbs, because it was almost like I imagined what would it be like if I were Oscar Wilde reading Hemingway, and like what kind of bitchy observations would I make about what he was trying to celebrate. So I put on my extra queer cap and just sort of read this sort of very Western, very American, very masculine collection of novels and short stories, and
Right.
made these sort of criticisms that I imagined someone like Wilde would have made.
Yeah.
And that sort of helped guide me.
No, I like that. I like that. Hemingway as read by Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
Another question I had about satire, which is
Mhm.
I'm curious to hear what you think, but it seems to me that when you're doing satire, you're sort of giving air to certain ideas that you're trying to sort of mock or exaggerate. Um, but you also hope that your readers are sort of getting your winking tone,
Yeah.
right? So I'm thinking, for example, of Lorna's lectures on rape. Um, and and you mentioned sort of Camille Paglia as being a model for her, but there's some stuff in there that you read it and I know that you're winking, but it's still it seems like another sort of hard line to walk as somebody writing satire.
Yes. So I'm really sensitive to this because my first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015. It was reviewed by the Huffington Post, and the critic wrote, it explored racism and classism and homophobia and sexism and ableism. And the critic at a certain point wrote, it's we sometimes have to wonder if the author is not, revealing his own bigotries.
Mm.
And I found that really wounding and frustrating because it's fiction. It's a work of fiction. And, the tricky thing about writing fiction, and particularly in this, very triggering, hypersensitive, landmined culture of ours, is people will misread your tone, will misread the voice, will misperceive the characters as
Right.
being mouthpieces for the author. And nothing is further from the truth. If I write about a sociopathic serial killer, it doesn't mean that I want to kill somebody. It doesn't mean that I want to hurt anybody. I'm trying to write as authentically and as believably as possible. So, you want to get into the headspace of these kind of despicable characters, because those are the ones that I most enjoy writing about.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that harm the world, and we
Right.
need to look at them. We need to look
Right.
at the people who harm the world.
Right.
And I have to always be careful to. It's tricky to make it too clear without overstating, because the last thing you want to do as a fiction writer is clumsily overly explain or make it seem like, hey,
Yeah.
look, this isn't me. These are the characters.
Yeah.
You hope that the reader will be able to discern that on their own.
Mhm.
I had an extraordinary editor, Laura Schleifer, probably the most empathetic, one of the most intelligent, careful readers I've met in my entire life. And I was lucky enough to have her as an editor. So, I trusted her feedback and her judgment as she read and gave me notes for the edit. And we had 3 rounds of edits. And so whatever is in this final draft, this published draft, I feel confident that it was vetted by her.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's something I think about. I've been thinking about true crime recently, and it sort of has a similar sort of potential pitfall, which is that, you in writing about a crime in all of its lurid detail, you're also sort of exploiting a bit people's desire to look at the lurid detail.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you create that distance from it? Yeah. Yeah.
I saw the Ryan Murphy Dahmer series on Netflix. I thought it was extraordinarily well done, and I was very impressed with it. But then I had to remind myself, these were real victims. These were real people, and it creates a lot of ambivalence. I have mixed feelings about true crime as a work of literature or as a film.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I knew when I was reading that it wasn't.
No, I know that you definitely are able to discern.
But it was interesting because, and maybe it's testament to the sort of, as you said, to the moment that we're in culturally. That people do jump to certain conclusions about art without giving an artist a chance to sort of explore ideas and explore different personas.
And I wish, I guess I hope that we can get back to a place where we can have a critical conversation about things. And, I think it's important to have a forum to debate and to disagree and to question. And then, leave enough room for answers, and whether those answers are satisfactory or not, that needs to be seen as well. There needs to be
Right.
room for that as well.
Right. The other big sort of factor in the way that you're doing this novel is the internet. The internet plays a big role here, right? And it's always kind of struck me as potentially difficult. I'm not a fiction writer myself, but to sort of capture the kind of disembodied communication of being online, the speed of it, the variety of experience. So how do you deal with that as a challenge?
As I was writing it, I admit that I do have an internet addiction. I definitely do. I'm not above it.
Who doesn't at this
Who
point?
doesn't? Yeah, honestly, it's really bad and quite compulsive. And I'm not on every social media app, but I am on Facebook. I am on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Twitter. I'm on quite a few of them, and I find that it starts to. I don't know if it created an ADD or ADHD set of symptoms within me, or if it's exacerbated them and they were always there. But I almost can't work, read, write, or surf without them becoming an interchangeable thing.
Yeah.
So it's like I'll work for 15 minutes, I'll go online for 5 minutes, I'll write for an hour, I'll read for an hour. And it's something that I need to bounce back and forth between. So it's not just the sort of flurry of images and ideas and access and sense of empowerment while you're online. It's also when you're not always online, the pull to get back into the computer, onto the phone.
Yeah. No, it's a problem. But I mean, it seems to me to be a problem if you want to be able to focus on something like writing a novel. But you also, I mean, this becomes part of the story, right? I mean, you're giving that problem to somebody like Theo too, right?
Or to Theo, and also to Risk and Lorna on some level. Risk. We didn't mention this yet, but the first half of the novel is in New York with him as a charter school teacher and secret owner. Silent owner, I guess, of the network. And then the second half is him in Spain with his family trying to become a matador and the fallout from that. The first half, he becomes incredibly envious of this other teacher, a science teacher named Dominic, with whom he's constantly competing. And he orchestrates all these team building exercises and has a friend, another colleague named Darnell, record them, these team building exercises, which are really competitive, sort of a series of competitions for him and Dominic to engage in, to upload onto YouTube. And they always end disastrously. But he puts them online anyway, because he feels like he comes across as some sort of victor in them. Yeah. Lorna is not necessarily as interested or fixated on the internet as her son or husband, but a student secretly records the lecture she gives on rape that you mentioned earlier, and puts it online. And there's a scandal, and she's fired from her college and sort of canceled. And that's what finally makes her decide, okay, fine, I'll pack it all up and I'll go to Madrid with my husband and son and reinvent myself there. But they all, on some level, are entangled with the internet, with social media, to varying degrees of destruction.
And then there's Theo, who's sort of throughout the entire novel is making a movie of all the things he's seeing around him, which struck me as, I mean, I guess in each of their cases, like the role of being caught on camera, of that kind of both the sense that something is kind of zooming in on you and watching you, but also creating some distance. It seems to me Theo is sort of not dealing with the reality of his family, and the camera creates a sort of barrier for him.
Absolutely. And there have been some really great essays by film scholars about this, particularly documentary filmmakers, how the camera gives the filmmaker an objective distance from their subject. And in this case, it's Theo who's objectively distancing from his subjects, which happen to be his mother and father, and also Javier Forza, who was, we haven't mentioned, the Spanish-Italian matador who was brought into the marriage. Yeah, by the way, also the marriage becomes a threesome in the second half of the book. It's a fun house. I
It's-
think Juno said that, right? Yeah.
um, can you, I mean, I guess the other thing that I was, the, this book, there's so many like big issues that the book sort of touches on. And I guess just, I'm curious, like generally speaking, do you feel, you know, saying like cancel culture or toxic masculinity, is fiction a good way to, or good maybe is not the right word, but a productive way to sort of unpack and explore these very fraught, touchy subjects?
I think so, and I hope so. I think, you know, a lot of psychologists have done research, a lot of neuroscientists have done research. They have found that fiction can increase empathy in
Mm,
readers. And my background is in clinical psychology, and I believe their research. I believe in their findings. I think that's the one thing that fiction can do that maybe film or nonfiction or any other art form or journalism can't do, is enhance empathy. You know, with film, you're sort of objectively watching a life play out. With journalism or nonfiction, you're learning, you're being educated. But with fiction, you're asked to assume the role phenomenologically of the character whose story you're engaging with. And I think that it teaches by illustration. I think if you're able to care enough about the characters and you see their what they go through and you get insight into their plight, that
mhm,
maybe you will be more sensitive to the subject
mhm,
or the challenges with which they are attempting to overcome. So I
mhm.
think it could be a tool. I hope that we start to regard it as much again in our culture. I know that it's having a little bit of a hard time right now, but I think there'll be a renaissance soon.
Do you feel like you're saying something about cancel culture in this book? I mean, is there a point of view that you're bringing to that debate?
So I hope that, you know, I think all fiction writers, like all artists, are philosophers naturally. I
Mhm,
mean, you know, a 300 plus page book is a worldview, you know,
mhm,
and presenting a point of view. I I also feel like I don't want to make any kind of declarative statement about my positions on any of those topics, because I always think that the kind of books or the kind of art that endures are the ones that ask a lot of questions and that remain kind of ambiguous and that don't tidy up in a message. Um, you know, and I try to not do that when I write fiction.
mhm,
Although I think if you read it, it does, my point of view does lean a particular way. And um, I do think that cancel culture has its place. I do think that maybe it is sometimes overly used or
mhm,
carelessly used. Um, I do think that toxic masculinity is real. I do think we label too many people with it.
mhm,
I do also think that it is probably the cause of most of our ills.
mhm,
I think it causes most wars. It
mhm.
causes most bar fights.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it leads to people speeding. I think it leads to
Bullfighting.
road rage, bullfighting. I think that most bad behavior in life can be trickled down to toxic masculinity. And that's not to say toxic men,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, right? It's a masculinity is a behavior.
Mhm,
It's not a
mhm.
sex.
Right. I have forgotten to tell people that they should be asking questions.
Oh yeah, please submit them.
You can write them in the live chat, and I think we're gonna get to them in just very few minutes. I basically just I have like one more question, which is a question I feel like I always wonder about sort of fiction writers and how they work and how they see the world and their art, and it's something that as a nonfiction writer I always feel curious about, which is um, where do your ideas come from? Like, where do your, when you've now written two novels,
Mhm.
I imagine somewhere in your mind you're casting about for a next novel. Um, where are the seeds for those books?
Um, you know, sometimes I don't know, and that's an honest answer. It sounds glib, but it's sometimes, usually, it starts with a concern. Um, Sometimes it's a personal complex, like insecurity,
Mhm.
sometime or my internet addiction.
Mhm.
So sometimes it is a curiosity, something I want to learn more about. I know that if I have an idea and it takes shape into a story and I'm still thinking about it 6 months later or a year later, it's
Mhm.
time to write a book about it.
Yeah.
So my first novel, The Unmentionable Man, was on my mind for about 2 years before I wrote the book. Performer Non Grata was on my mind for about a year before I sat down and started writing it. My
Mm.
new book is called Julian's Debut. I'm still
Mhm.
working on a final draft for it. It was on my mind for about a year until I
Mhm.
sat down and started writing it.
Right.
I need to dwell on a thing for at least a year. If it goes out of my mind before that year is up, I don't bother
Mm.
writing because it takes a long time. It takes years
Right.
to write a novel.
Right. But is I guess what I meant to ask, like, is there ever just like this kernel that you can point to where you're like, oh, I saw this thing on the street, or I read this newspaper story, or like, this I mean, I guess what I guess it sounds like what you're saying is it's some kind of feeling or problem that you're trying to explore, and then you're finding the characters in the story to help you do that.
Yeah, and it's also not conscious, which
Mm.
is a weird thing that is sort of mystifying to me still. That I
Mhm.
never really fully know how these stories, what that enzyme is. I know how they gel because they
Right.
stay on my mind for a while, and then I start to do the conscious work of putting together a plot and
Right.
developing characters. But yeah, it's just sort of like this nagging sense of, well, I think I need to explore this thing, whatever the
Mhm.
thing happens to be, and then so it starts with a theme, really, and then the story and a plot and characters form from there,
Yeah.
sort of like an inside out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I can imagine there's other fiction writers for whom like the themes come later, or they start just, there's like some story that interests them, and then they find their
Right.
way to the bigger themes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to some questions. I have one that is a variation of something that I was going to ask, which is to tell us the top three books that have had the most influence on your life and writing, and the version of that I was going to ask was, I was specifically curious about sort of satirical writing. If there were books that you kind of look to as models. I mean, you mentioned some authors before, um, but you can answer any version of that.
Sure. My favorite writer probably is Vladimir Nabokov.
Mm,
I've read about a dozen of his books. I go back to him all the time whenever I'm stuck. If I don't know how to do something in a book, whenever I experience writer's block, I read some Nabokov, and
mm,
that helps. Again, because he does that thing where he's able to write satirically about caricatures, but his prose are perfect, to begin with. But
mhm,
also he's able to write satirically about people as caricatures, but also he's incredibly humane and insightful.
mm,
So, of his books, probably Lolita,
mm,
Laughter in the Dark, and maybe Ada or Ardor or Pale
mm,
Fire.
mm.
Um, I'm also, God, there's so many writers. It's so overwhelming sometimes to just
I
narrow it
have
down
the
to
same
three.
problem when anybody
Yeah,
asks me a question like
it's
this.
it's just there's so many. I mean, I'm reading Otessa Moshfegh now.
Yeah,
I just read My Year of Rest and Relaxation,
I can
and
see that you would like her. Yeah, yeah,
oh, she's fantastic.
yeah,
I'm going to read all of her books now. I've only read the one, but I'm hoping to get her on the show because I really want to tell her how much I love her writing.
yeah.
Uh, and contemporary, I love Mary Gateskill. I mentioned her before. Veronica had a great impact on me.
Mm,
I love Joyce Carol Oates. Blonde is a masterpiece.
mhm.
Um, Edmund White, of course, he's a
Yeah.
dear friend, and he's also just the most reliably skilled and gifted writer. James Baldwin.
Mm.
Yi Yun Lee is incredible.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Just incredible. I can go on. I mean, it'll take an hour for me to list all the writers I love.
No, that's great. That's
Yeah.
great. You named some.
Virginia Woolf. Sorry, Virginia Woolf also had a big influence on me when I was younger.
Hmm. Another question from Dennis Leroy Kangali. This is a little bit longer. I'll read it out. The book's story and its plots would have faltered in the hands of a less capable writer. You excel at bringing a gravity to the absurd or ridiculous and allowing the satire to be savage, but never losing a clear-eyed vision of truth. Curious how you came upon the style of the book, and if your ideas evolved out of your characters or the imposed ideas themes themselves, just as a version of like what we were talking about. And what surprises did you as a writer encounter?
Well, I think, thank you for that question, Dennis. It's again, it starts with a theme, and then the characters and the story and the plot, and all the beats are in service of that theme. And I am very, kind of OCD or meticulous, I should say, about making sure that every character or plot beat hews to that theme. It's something I pride myself being disciplined about that, always going back to my set of themes and making sure that there's nothing in the book, whether it be a character or a situation or a beat, that doesn't serve the theme. So it all starts for me with the theme and then goes outward from there. What surprises did I, as a writer, encounter? I think I was surprised by how frankly I was able to write about insecurity. I think people who know me well will realize that there's more than a little bit of me in some of these characters. I'm not proud of it, but that's as honest as I can be without totally scandalizing myself.
A question from Lenore Regal. This book is a tour de force. I noticed that Lorna is based to some extent on Camille Paglia, as we said. How did you come to know her and her work, and how did she come to inspire your own Lorna?
Thank you, Lenore. Great question. I have mixed feelings about Camille Paglia. I think Sexual Personae is a dynamic book. Just a book that's really on fire. And you may disagree with some of its philosophies and politics, but the writing and her risk-taking is just so awesome, so impressive. So I wanted to sort of write a story. Well, I wanted to create a character in Lorna Hall Bonaventura that was a bit of a academic rock star, right? There are fewer of them now in our culture, and when we have them, they are lightning rods, like Jordan Peterson, for example, or Camille Paglia, Judith Butler, but like a Deleuze or a Guattari or a Spivak or a Kristeva, any one of those critical theory figures that we romanticize. I wanted to create a character who is really smart, really well-informed, and maybe even well-intentioned, but she also puts her foot in her mouth by saying the wrong thing the wrong way at the wrong time. Maybe it's a product of her arrogance, that she's not more careful with her wording, and that's what gets her into trouble. But, one of my favorite TV shows of all time is Veep on HBO. I'm obsessed with that show. And that character, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, she becomes president eventually. She's a complete mess, and she makes every conceivable mistake and does everything wrong, yet she's the president. And I'm very fascinated by characters who are in power, who are also kind of brilliant, but also buffoons. So I wanted to sort of create one myself.
She reminded me a little bit of Tar, Lydia Tar.
Yeah. I love them. That's my favorite movie of last year. And when I saw it, I kept thinking, oh my God, I have to make sure that I talk about Tar whenever I do press. So thanks for reminding me, because I got there first, Todd Fields.
The scene where she's giving the lesson and getting videotapes.
Yeah. Would you say, Bach, are you into him?
Yeah. No, it was amazing. Okay, let's make this the last question. It's a good one to end on. From Albert, another question from Albert Benbassa. Looking forward to reading your new novel. Can you talk a little about your thoughts on the recent rash of book bans at public and school libraries in the U.S.?
It's completely bizarre and surreal and terrifying. I kind of can't believe it's happening, because it seems so absurd and so anti-democratic that it's sort of shocking that it's actually really unfolding as it is. I pray that this book is banned one day. That would be a great honor. I also adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story recently, and Michael Carroll and Igor Karash, my co-writer and the illustrator, and I joke, it would be wonderful if that graphic novel got banned as well, because not only is it great for sales, but also it gets a conversation going. And
Right.
I think if the book bans are doing two things that are useful to authors, it's that it's helping their sales, and it's also creating a dialogue that we really need to be having. It's
Hmm.
creating a conversation that's really, really important.
Hmm.
So I'm really it's a double-edged sword, and I guess maybe I'm trying to find the silver lining. But yeah, it's atrocious, but also at least those things are happening.
Right. The silver lining I always find, and maybe it's sort of cold comfort, but it means that people care enough about the power of books. They feel the power of books if they're if they're looking. I mean, it will be a Saturday when like just nobody cares,
Right,
and
right.
books are just seen to have such little influence that they're not even thought of as potentially politically harmful to the children.
Yes,
There's yeah.
yeah, and that's another thing. It shows that they're not powerless, they're not innocuous, that they are, dangerous and provocative enough for people to want to ban them and to
Yeah,
talk about
yeah,
them.
yeah.
Cole, the two other questions that came in, would you mind?
Yeah, no, I see
Yes,
those.
okay, yeah,
I
thanks.
see one. So let's stay a little bit longer from Dr. Alexis Cohen. What is your process for connecting with the psychodynamics of your characters?
So I did go to, thank you, Dr. Cohen. I did go to graduate school for clinical psychology at Columbia, and the orientation was psychodynamic. It was sort of transitioning at the time from psychodynamic, that is Freudian, Jungian, psychoanalytic, to cognitive behavioral. So we had one foot in both worlds at the time. We were there during that transitional period, and I I guess I'm a Freudian if I had to. I know he's also not in vogue anymore, and sort of a controversial figure, a problematic figure. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to him, because he does provoke dialogue and conversation and thought. My process for connecting with the psychodynamics, I think Risk and Lorna are both narcissists. I'm not sure that they're sociopaths, but they're definitely narcissists at the very least. And that kind of self God bless
Excuse
you.
me.
God
Sorry.
bless you. That kind of self-aggrandizing, self-regarding behavior is always very interesting to me, like Tar, like Lydia Tar in the movie Tar. So I wanted to look at the machinations of narcissism. And I just drew from my training, I drew from my education, I drew from my practice. I also taught the subject for 13 years. I've known more than one narcissist in my lifetime. And I think both of those characters are probably composites of people I've met throughout my life, those who shall not be named publicly. Uh, so, I mean, that's just sort of a little bit of insight into that process.
Yeah. And one more good question from Laura Schleifer. Can you talk a bit about the theme of nature in the book? I was interested in how you brought Thoreau into it, and was wondering if you could elaborate on how that relates thematically.
So Lorna does this very dangerous thing, this very dangerous sort of pseudo-intellectual thing in her writing and in her teaching, in that she's an essentialist, right? She is of this mind that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and that gender is binary, and that it is not performative. And she, this is what gets her into a lot of trouble. And I'm not saying I agree with it. Again, this is fiction, and she is on one level kind of a villain in the story because of those positions, because I don't personally believe in them, for the record, but she does. And she does this thing where she tries to convince her readers and her students that there's like a profundity to it, to essentialism, and that if you read Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, and transcendentalism, it's all right there, and that it's a profound thing to be what your nature wants you to be, and that it cannot be altered through performance or surgery. So I wanted to create this lethal pseudo-intellectual who does damage through her mouth, really, and through her writing, by extolling these virtues. And the culture is smarter than she thinks it is, and that's why she ends up in the predicament throughout the book. And in the end, too, when she thinks she's able to start afresh in Madrid with a new teaching assignment, even those young students are quite savvy to what she had done in New York, and they call her out on it. The other thing about nature is I wanted to look at how we treat non-human animals, right? With the metaphor of the bullfighting, and how that cruelty and that apathy and that barbarism trickles down to how we also treat our fellow person, our fellow human, and how that sort of how they feed off of one another. It's a good question. Thank you, Laura.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian. This was fascinating and fun. And here's the book. There you go. And I wish you a lot of luck with it. And I hope people get out and read it because it's a wild ride.
Thank you, Gul, for doing this. And I'd like to tell everyone I'll be at the Rainbow Book Fair tomorrow. It goes from 12 to 6. It's at the Bureau of General Services, the center in New York City, and I'll be reading at 4 p.m. from the book, and I'll be selling copies and signing copies as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.